The decision to return home was not planned in the way major decisions in his life usually were, with meetings, schedules, assistants, and carefully managed expectations. This time, there were no calls made in advance, no messages sent to prepare the household, and no instructions given to staff. The billionaire simply found himself at the end of a long stretch of distance and time, standing at the edge of a choice he had delayed for years. His life had been defined by expansion, acquisitions, and constant movement between cities and countries, each day filled with obligations that seemed more urgent than the quiet responsibilities waiting behind him. Home had become something he visited in memory rather than in reality, a place he knew existed but rarely allowed himself to think about in detail. Over time, absence had a way of becoming normal, and the longer he stayed away, the easier it became to justify another delay, another month, another year. Yet something had shifted recently, an unspoken pull that he could not ignore, a realization that success measured in numbers and influence had left gaps in places that could not be filled by anything he had accumulated. Without announcing his departure to anyone, he cleared his immediate schedule, stepped away from the constant attention that followed him, and made arrangements for a quiet arrival. The journey itself was uneventful, lacking the security detail and public visibility that usually accompanied him, allowing him to move with a simplicity that felt unfamiliar yet strangely grounding. As he approached the familiar address, the exterior of the property appeared unchanged, the same gates, the same structure, the same carefully maintained appearance that suggested stability and continuity. From a distance, it seemed untouched by time, a place preserved as though waiting for his return, though he knew that appearances could be deceptive when it came to matters that unfolded behind closed doors. He paused briefly before entering, not out of hesitation in the physical sense, but out of a momentary awareness that stepping inside would reconnect him to a part of his life he had long kept at a distance. There was no reception waiting for him, no formal greeting arranged, only the quiet expectation of a space that had continued without him. As he crossed the threshold, the atmosphere felt different from what he remembered, not necessarily altered in a visible way, but carrying a subtle weight that suggested routines had formed in his absence. The silence inside was not empty but layered, as though filled with unspoken habits and interactions that had developed over time. He observed the surroundings with a careful eye, noting small details that did not immediately align with his memory of the place, the positioning of objects, the presence of items he did not recall, and the absence of things he once considered part of the household's normal structure. Each observation added to a growing awareness that life within these walls had continued to evolve independently of his presence. His return was not announced, not anticipated, and not shaped by any expectations he had previously set, which meant that the reactions to his arrival would be genuine rather than rehearsed. In that unprepared moment, he stood as both an outsider and the person to whom the space ultimately belonged, a contradiction that made the experience feel unfamiliar despite its familiarity. The weight of years spent away seemed to settle into the present as he took in the quiet environment, recognizing that his return marked the beginning of an encounter not just with a physical place, but with the reality of everything that had unfolded in his absence, a reality he had yet to fully understand. As he stepped further inside, the absence of immediate recognition or acknowledgement from within the house created an unsettling contrast to what he had expected. In a place where his presence once triggered movement, greetings, and a sense of structured response, there was now a stillness that felt deliberate rather than accidental. The air carried a quiet tension, not loud or obvious, but present in the way spaces seemed occupied even when no one was visibly moving through them. He paused, listening carefully, trying to identify familiar sounds that would normally define the rhythm of the household: footsteps in the hallway, a door opening, a voice calling out, the subtle cues that signal activity behind closed doors. Instead, there was only a muted silence, interrupted occasionally by faint, indistinct noises that could not be immediately placed, adding to the sense that something was happening just beyond his awareness. He began to walk slowly through the entryway, his eyes adjusting to details that did not match the mental image he carried from years ago. The lighting, the arrangement of furniture, and even the cleanliness of surfaces suggested that someone had been maintaining order, but not necessarily in the way he had once overseen. It was not neglect that he observed, but a different kind of care, one that followed its own logic and priorities. This realization led him to question not only what had changed, but how those changes had taken shape without his knowledge. It was as if the house itself had become a stage where actions occurred off-screen, leaving behind traces that hinted at interactions he had not witnessed. He also noticed that the sense of familiarity he once associated with the space was now layered with uncertainty. Rooms that had once felt predictable now carried a degree of ambiguity, not because their physical structure had changed, but because their use and meaning within the household might have evolved. The environment no longer responded to his memory alone. It required observation in the present moment to understand what it had become. This shift created a quiet disconnect between expectation and reality, forcing him to rely on perception rather than recollection. At the same time, there was an underlying awareness that his presence, though unannounced, had already begun to register within the house. Even without direct acknowledgement, the possibility that someone might become aware of his return added a layer of anticipation to each step he took. He remained attentive, not only to what he could see, but to what might reveal itself in response to his arrival. The stillness that surrounded him did not feel empty, but rather held in a state of readiness, as though the environment and its occupants were poised to react once his presence was fully recognized. And as he stood there, taking in the quiet shifts and subtle signs that surrounded him, the realization grew that whatever structure had been established in his absence was now in place. Operating in ways that had yet to fully reveal themselves to him, his attention eventually shifted as he made his way deeper into the house, and that was when he saw her. His daughter stood in a part of the home that he remembered as a place of openness and comfort, yet her posture did not reflect the ease he once associated with her in that same space. She appeared composed, but in a way that suggested restraint rather than natural relaxation. The expression on her face was controlled, her movements measured, as though she had become accustomed to maintaining a certain presence at all times. It was not the carefree demeanor he carried in his memory, and that contrast alone was enough to draw his focus and hold it there longer than he expected. He observed her quietly at first, noting small details that revealed more than any immediate conversation could. The way she stood, the distance she kept from surrounding objects, and the subtle hesitation before she shifted her weight from one foot to the other all contributed to a sense that her behavior had adapted over time. These were not dramatic changes that would be immediately obvious to a casual observer, but to someone who knew her before, they stood out clearly. Her body language suggested awareness, not just of her surroundings, but of herself within those surroundings, as though she had learned to position herself carefully in response to something unspoken. As he continued to watch, he noticed that her gaze did not wander freely as it once had. Instead, it remained focused, occasionally lowering or shifting in a way that hinted at consideration before action. There was a certain discipline in the way she carried herself, one that suggested she had been guided, corrected, or influenced over time. This was not the spontaneous behavior he associated with her earlier years, but something more structured, shaped by routine or expectation. The absence of overt emotional expression made it difficult to immediately understand her state of mind, yet the consistency of her composure indicated that this was not temporary, but rather something that had become part of her daily manner. He also became aware that her reactions, though subtle, seemed slightly delayed, as if she was processing her environment before responding to it. This created an impression that she was operating with an internal awareness that balanced observation and restraint. It was not that she lacked emotion, but that she was managing it in a controlled manner. The changes were not only visible in her posture and expression, but also in the way she occupied space. She no longer filled a room with casual presence, but instead remained contained, aware of boundaries both physical and unspoken. As he stood there, Trying to reconcile the image he carried in his memory with the reality before him, he began to recognize that her transformation was not accidental. It reflected time, influence, and perhaps experiences that had gradually reshaped her behavior in his absence. The familiarity he once had with her was still present beneath the surface, but it was layered with adjustments that had altered how she presented herself to the world. These adjustments suggested that she had been navigating her environment with a level of independence that required her to adapt in ways he had not witnessed. There was also a quiet sense of distance between them that went beyond physical space. Even without a conversation taking place, the difference in her demeanor created a boundary that felt unfamiliar. He remained still, observing, taking in the details of her presence as she continued with whatever she had been doing before noticing him. In that moment, the house did not feel like a place of immediate reunion, but rather a setting where time had already shaped relationships in ways that were now only beginning to come into view. And as he continued to watch her composed and altered behavior, he understood that the version of his daughter standing before him had been formed through a period of change he had not been present to witness. His focus soon shifted from his daughter to another presence in the room, the maid whose demeanor stood out in a way that was difficult to ignore. She moved with a level of calmness that did not seem affected by the sudden change in the household's atmosphere caused by his unexpected arrival. While others might have shown visible surprise or urgency upon seeing him after such a long absence, she remained steady, her expression composed, her actions uninterrupted. This composure was not the absence of awareness, but rather the presence of control, as though she had already accounted for moments like this in her understanding of the environment she worked in. He watched her closely, noting how she carried out her tasks with a sense of familiarity that suggested she was deeply accustomed to the rhythm of the household. There was no hesitation in her movements, no signs of confusion or adjustment in response to his appearance. Instead, she continued in a manner that implied continuity, as if his return, while important, did not disrupt the structure she had maintained over time. This kind of behavior naturally drew attention, not because it was loud or assertive, but because it was consistent and deliberate in contrast to the uncertainty he might have expected. The way she positioned herself within the space also reflected an awareness of boundaries and roles. She neither avoided his presence nor acknowledged it in an exaggerated manner. Her neutrality was itself notable, suggesting that she understood how to operate within the dynamics of the household without drawing unnecessary attention. This balance indicated experience, not just in performing duties, but in managing interactions with the individuals who occupied the home. She appeared to move with an internal map of expectations, responding to the environment with precision rather than reaction. As he continued observing, he noticed that her attention seemed divided between her tasks and the people around her, yet she maintained an even distribution of focus that prevented any visible lapse in her responsibilities. This ability to remain composed under unexpected circumstances hinted at a level of confidence in her role. She did not rush, nor did she slow down. Instead, she maintained a steady pace that conveyed assurance. Her behavior suggested that she was not merely reacting to the presence of authority, but functioning within a system where her position was clearly understood and consistently applied. There was also an element of quiet control in the way she interacted with the space itself. Objects were handled with care, movements were efficient, and transitions between tasks appeared seamless. Nothing about her actions seemed accidental or improvised. Instead, each step appeared to follow an established pattern that had likely been repeated over time. This repetition did not make her behavior mechanical, but rather refined, as though experience had allowed her to operate with minimal need for adjustment. The environment around her seemed to respond to her presence in a subtle way, maintaining order through her consistent involvement. He also began to sense that her calmness extended beyond physical actions and into her overall presence within the household. Even without direct communication, there was an impression that she held an understanding of the internal dynamics at play. This understanding was reflected not in words, but in her ability to remain steady while others might have shown signs of disruption. Her composure created a kind of anchor within the space, a point of stability that contrasted with the uncertainty introduced by his unannounced return. As he continued to take in her behavior, he realized that her role within the household had likely evolved into something more than just routine assistance. Her presence carried a sense of familiarity with the environment that suggested long-term involvement and adaptation. She appeared to function not only as someone performing tasks, but as someone who had become integrated into the ongoing structure of the home, maintaining balance through consistency and quiet assurance, while remaining attentive to everything unfolding around her. As he stood there observing the room, his attention began to shift between his daughter and the maid, and in that shifting focus, subtle patterns started to emerge. The way they occupied the same space suggested more than just coincidence or routine interaction. There was a dynamic at play that could not be easily defined at first glance, yet it became more noticeable the longer he remained silent and attentive. Their movements, timing, and even pauses seemed to follow an unspoken understanding, as though both were aware of cues that were not immediately visible to him. He noticed how his daughter occasionally adjusted her posture in response to the maid's presence, not in a way that suggested discomfort, but in a manner that indicated awareness and responsiveness. These adjustments were small, almost imperceptible, yet consistent enough to suggest that they were part of an established pattern. At the same time, the maid's behavior did not change when interacting with his daughter. She maintained the same level of composure, the same measured approach, regardless of who was present. This consistency created an impression that roles within the space had been clearly defined over time, and both individuals were operating within those roles without needing explicit direction. The interaction between them did not involve overt communication at that moment, yet there seemed to be an exchange of signals that guided their actions. A glance, a pause, a slight shift in position, each of these could have carried meaning that was not obvious to an outside observer. He found himself trying to interpret these subtle exchanges, recognizing that what he was witnessing might be the result of repeated interactions that had gradually shaped their behavior toward one another. Over time, such patterns often develop into something stable, where both parties understand expectations without needing to verbalize them. He also began to consider the possibility that influence within the household was not solely determined by hierarchy or title, but by the consistency of presence and the nature of interactions over time. The maid's calm and steady demeanor appeared to have an effect on the overall atmosphere, creating a sense of structure that others seemed to align with. His daughter's behavior, while still her own, seemed to reflect an adaptation to this environment, suggesting that her daily experiences had contributed to shaping how she responded to situations and individuals within the home. As he continued to observe, he noticed that the space between them was not defined by distance alone, but by a kind of behavioral alignment. They moved without interfering with each other, yet their actions appeared coordinated in a way that reduced friction and maintained continuity. This did not necessarily imply direct control, but rather an established familiarity with each other's routines and tendencies. Such familiarity often leads to a balance where each person anticipates the other's actions, resulting in interactions that appear smooth and uninterrupted. There was also a sense that roles within the household had been reinforced through repetition. The maid's responsibilities and his daughter's daily habits seemed to intersect in ways that created a structured environment where each person understood their position. This structure may not have been explicitly discussed, but it was evident in the way both individuals conducted themselves. The absence of visible conflict or confusion suggested that whatever dynamic existed between them had reached a level of stability, even if the nature of that stability was not immediately clear to him. He remained still, taking in these observations without interrupting the flow of their actions. The more he watched, the more he became aware that the relationship between his daughter and the maid was not defined by a single moment or interaction, but by a collection of repeated experiences that had gradually formed a pattern. This pattern influenced how they responded to each other and how they operated within the shared space, creating a dynamic that functioned quietly in the background, shaping the environment in ways that were not immediately visible but became increasingly apparent with careful observation as he stood there taking in everything unfolding before him. A growing realization began to settle in his mind, one that was not based on a single observation but on the accumulation of all the subtle signs he had noticed since entering the house. Each detail, each behavior, and each interaction pointed toward a larger picture that had developed over time without his presence. The silence that greeted him at the entrance, the composed demeanor of his daughter, the calm control of the maid, and the quiet interaction between them all contributed to an environment that had clearly continued to function independently. It became evident that his absence had not resulted in pause or decline, but in the formation of a system that operated on its own terms. He began to understand that the household was no longer in the state he had left it in. Structures that once depended on his oversight had evolved into something self-sustaining. Routines had been established, roles had been defined, and responsibilities had been distributed in a way that allowed daily life to continue without interruption. This realization did not come as a sudden shock, but rather as a gradual acknowledgement that everything he was observing had been shaped by time, experience, and adaptation. The people within the house had not remained static during his absence. Instead, they had adjusted, responded, and evolved in ways that allowed the environment to remain stable. His attention returned briefly to the spaces around him, noting how everything appeared orderly yet different from what he remembered. The organization of objects, the flow of movement within rooms, and the quiet efficiency with which tasks were carried out all indicated that the household had developed its own internal rhythm. This rhythm did not require external correction in the way it might have in the past. Instead, it seemed to function through established patterns that had been reinforced repeatedly over time. The absence of disruption suggested that these patterns were not new, but rather well-practiced and understood by those who lived within the space. He also recognized that his arrival, though significant in his perspective, did not immediately alter the way the household operated. The continuity he observed remained intact, even in his presence. This indicated that the system in place was not easily influenced by a single event, but was instead built on consistency that had been maintained over an extended period. The individuals within the house continued to act in accordance with what had already been established, rather than reacting abruptly to his unexpected return. This further reinforced the idea that his absence had allowed a structure to develop that no longer depended on his immediate involvement. As he processed this realization, he became aware that what he was witnessing was not simply a matter of change, but of progression. The household had moved forward in his absence, adapting to circumstances and forming its own balance. This progression was reflected in the behavior of those within it, as well as in the environment itself. The stability he observed was not accidental, but the result of continuous adjustment and alignment among the people who remained. Each element within the house appeared to contribute to this stability, whether through routine actions, behavioral consistency, or mutual understanding. Standing there, he could see that the life within the house had continued beyond his awareness, developing into something that functioned with a degree of independence. The realization that everything had reached a point where it no longer required his direct presence to maintain order was both clear and unavoidable. It reflected not just the passage of time, but the way that absence can lead to the formation of systems that sustain themselves, shaped by those who remained and adapted through experience, resulting in a household that had grown into its current state without interruption from the person who once stood at its center.